Have you ever wanted to say something in English, but froze the moment you opened your mouth? That was me, too scared to speak, too afraid of making mistakes. But one simple lesson changed everything. It wasn't about grammar or big words. It was about letting go of fear. Want to know how I finally found my voice? The fear of speaking English. My name is Haster, and for as long as I can remember, I have been afraid of speaking English. It was not because I didn't understand the language. In fact, I could read English books, write long essays, and even score well on my grammar tests. I knew the rules, the words, and how to form sentences. But every time I had to speak English out loud, something strange happened to me. It was like my brain stopped working. I would think of a sentence in my mind, but the moment I tried to say it, my tongue felt heavy, and my lips refused to move. It was as if there was an invisible wall stopping my words from coming out. My thoughts would run in circles, and I would start doubting myself. What if I say something wrong? What if my pronunciation is bad? What if people laugh at me? These questions would fill my head so quickly that, before I could even try, the moment would pass. Someone else would answer the question, and I would sit there silently, feeling ashamed. Whenever I was in class, I admired my classmates who spoke English so easily. They raised their hands, answered the teacher's questions, and even talked to each other in English, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. I wanted to be like them. I wanted to speak freely, without fear, without hesitation. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. Every time I thought about speaking, my heart would start pounding like a drum. My hands would feel cold and sweaty, and my face would turn hot. It felt like everyone was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. English, to me, was like a giant mountain, tall, scary, and impossible to climb. I felt like I was stuck at the bottom, looking up at the peak, too afraid to take the first step. This fear was everywhere. It followed me to school, to gatherings with friends, and even to small conversations with strangers. I wanted to speak, but my fear held me back like heavy chains wrapped around me. I remember one day in class when my teacher asked a simple question. It was something I knew the answer to, something I had read about just the night before. I wanted to raise my hand. I wanted to speak. But as soon as I thought about it, my fear took over. What if my voice shakes? What if I forget a word? What if the teacher doesn't understand me? My mind was flooded with doubts, and I stayed silent once again. The teacher moved on, and another student answered. I watched as they spoke with confidence, and a deep sadness filled my heart. I felt trapped, like I was locked inside a cage. But the strange thing was that this cage was made by my own fears. No one was stopping me from speaking. My teacher encouraged me, my friends wanted to listen, and no one had ever made fun of me. The only thing stopping me was my own mind. At night, I would lie in bed and think about all the chances I had missed. Why didn't I speak today? Why do I let fear control me? I wished I could go back and try again, but the day was already over. I knew something had to change. I knew I couldn't live in fear forever. But how? How could I break free from this fear? I had no idea. All I knew was that I wanted to change. I wanted to speak English without fear, without hesitation, and without worrying about mistakes. I didn't want to stay silent anymore, but I didn't know where to start. 2. The moment of realization. It was a bright morning, and I sat in my English class, feeling nervous as always. Our teacher, Mr. Benson, was standing at the front of the classroom, explaining the lesson in his usual energetic way. The topic for the day was how to express your thoughts in English. I listened carefully, writing down notes, but deep inside I felt uneasy. I knew that soon he would ask someone to share their thoughts. As I gripped my pen tightly, hoping I wouldn't be called, I heard my name. Haster, what do you think about today's lesson? My heart started racing. I could feel my classmates turning to look at me. My throat felt dry, and my hands became sweaty. I knew the answer. The words were right there in my mind. I had understood everything he taught. But suddenly, a wave of fear washed over me. What if I said something wrong? What if I mispronounced a word? What if everyone laughed at me? I opened my mouth slightly, but no words came out. My mind was filled with doubts. I looked at my notebook, pretending to check my notes, hoping he would ask someone else instead. The room felt silent, waiting for my answer. Mr. Benson didn't rush me. He just smiled patiently and said, "Haster, stop thinking and start talking." At that moment, his words hit me like a lightning bolt. Stop thinking and start talking? I had always believed that I needed to think carefully before speaking. I thought I had to be perfect to make sure every word was correct. But now I realize something different. Maybe my problem wasn't that I didn't know English. Maybe my problem was that I was thinking too much. For so long, I had been trapped in my own mind, worrying about every little mistake, overanalyzing every sentence before I even spoke. But in doing so, I had stopped myself from actually speaking at all. That day, something changed inside me. I made a decision. I would not let fear control me anymore. I would stop overthinking and start speaking no matter what. I took a deep breath, looked at Mr. Benson, and finally spoke. My voice was shaky. My words were not perfect, but I had taken the first step, and that was the moment everything began to change. 3. My first challenge. Speaking without fear elaborated. After class, I felt restless. Mr. Benson's words, "Stop thinking and start talking," kept echoing in my mind. How could it be that simple? All my life, I had been afraid of speaking English. I had spent so much time thinking about the perfect way to say something, only to remain silent. Was the fear of making mistakes really the thing holding me back? I hesitated for a moment, but then, gathering all my courage, I slowly walked up to Mr. Benson's desk. He was stacking some books when I softly asked, "Sir, what did you mean when you said I should stop thinking and start talking?" Mr. Benson smiled, as if he had been expecting this question. He put the books aside and gestured for me to sit. "Haster," he said kindly, "many people struggle to speak English not because they don't know the words, but because they are too afraid of making mistakes. Their fear stops them before they even try." I lowered my gaze. He was right. I knew English. I could read, I could write, but when it came to speaking, fear always held me back. "But sir," I said hesitantly, "what if I say something wrong? What if people laugh at me?" Mr. Benson chuckled. "Tell me, Haster, when a baby learns to walk, does it fall?" I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. "And do the parents scold the baby for falling?" He continued. "No," I said, shaking my head. "They encourage the baby to keep trying." "Exactly," Mr. Benson said. "And that's how language works too. You have to allow yourself to fall, to make mistakes so you can get better. Fluency doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from practice. The more you speak, the more confident you become." His words made sense, but I still felt uncertain. Speaking English still seemed like an enormous challenge. Sensing my hesitation, Mr. Benson leaned forward and said, "I'm going to give you a challenge, Haster." I looked up curious. "From today onwards," he continued, "you must speak English for at least 1 hour every single day. No matter what, you have to keep talking. Don't stop to think too much. Don't worry about mistakes. Just talk." I blinked. 1 whole hour? That sounded impossible. I could barely speak for a few seconds without feeling anxious. An hour seemed like an eternity. I gulped and asked, "Sir, how can I talk for a whole hour? I don't think I can do it." Mr. Benson smiled reassuringly. "You don't have to do it all at once. Start small. Describe what you see. Talk to yourself. Think in English. But no matter what, you must keep speaking. The more you do it, the easier it will become." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to say no. A whole hour of speaking English every day felt like climbing a tall mountain without any preparation. What if I failed? What if I made too many mistakes? But then I remembered something Mr. Benson had said. Fluency comes from practice, not perfection. Taking a deep breath, I finally said, "Okay, sir. I'll do my best." Mr. Benson patted my shoulder. "That's the spirit, Haster. Just remember, don't be afraid. Keep talking, and soon you'll see the difference." As I walked home that day, my heart was filled with both excitement and fear. Could I really do this? 1 hour of speaking English every day? It seemed impossible, but I had accepted the challenge, and I wasn't going to give up before I even started. I had spent years thinking and staying silent. Now it was time to stop thinking and start talking. 4. Thinking in English. The first step in my journey to speaking English fluently was to train my brain to think in English instead of my native language. Mr. Benson, my teacher, told me something that I had never thought about before. He said, if you always think in your native language and then translate into English, your words will always come slowly. But if you start thinking in English, your words will come naturally, just like they do in your own language. This made me curious. How could I start thinking in English? I had never done that before. My thoughts had always been in my native language. When I wanted to say something in English, I would first think in my own language, then try to find the English words. And by the time I was ready to speak, it was already too late. This was the biggest reason I was so slow at speaking. Describing the world around me. Mr. Benson gave me a simple exercise. Describe everything around you in English, even when you're alone. That day, as I walked home from school, I decided to try it. At first, I felt a little silly talking to myself, but I reminded myself that this was part of my learning. I looked at the road and said in a soft voice, "The road is long." I looked up at the sky and whispered, "The sky is blue." I felt the wind on my face and thought, "The wind is cold." At first, it felt awkward. I wasn't used to talking to myself, and my brain wanted to switch back to my native language. Every time I saw something, my first instinct was to describe it in my own language and then translate it. But I stopped myself. I reminded myself, no translating. Think in English. So I kept going. I saw children playing and thought, the children are happy. They're running fast. I saw a cat sitting under a car and said, the cat is sleeping. It looks comfortable. I touched my school bag and thought, my bag is heavy. I have too many books. At first, I only used simple sentences. I didn't try to make long or difficult ones. But as I kept practicing, I started using more words. Instead of just saying, the road is long, I tried saying, the road is very long, and it has many cracks. The cars are moving fast on it. The more I practiced, the more I realized that something amazing was happening. I was no longer translating. My brain was slowly starting to think directly in English. How thinking in English changed everything. After a few days of practicing this, something strange happened. One morning, I woke up, and the first thing I thought was, "It is a beautiful day." For the first time in my life, my brain spoke to me in English before my native language. I was so excited that I jumped out of bed and started describing everything in my room. My bed is soft. My pillow is white. My books are on the table. My shoes are under the chair. I felt like my brain was finally waking up in English. It was a small success, but it felt huge to me. As I continued this exercise every day, my brain got faster and faster. I didn't have to stop and think in my native language anymore. When I saw a car, my mind immediately said, "The car is red and shiny." When I saw a friend, my brain thought, "She looks happy today." I didn't have to translate. The words just appeared in my mind naturally, like magic. My secret game, talking to myself. After a few weeks, I made the exercise even more fun. I started playing a game where I pretended to be two people having a conversation. For example, I would imagine that I was in a shop. I would say, "Hello, can I buy some apples?" Then I would pretend to be the shopkeeper and answer, "Yes. How many do you want?" At first, I only played this game in my head, but later I started whispering it to myself when I was alone. I would imagine different situations, ordering food at a restaurant, asking for directions, meeting a new friend, and I would practice all these conversations by myself. This little game helped me a lot. It made me feel more comfortable speaking English, even when no one was around. The big change. Thinking in English was like unlocking a hidden door in my brain. The more I practiced, the easier it became. Soon, I was able to form sentences quickly, without hesitation. My words came naturally, and I no longer felt stuck when trying to speak. That was when I finally understood what Mr. Benson meant. Thinking in English was the key to fluency. Once I stopped translating and started thinking directly in English, everything changed. Speaking English became easier, and my confidence grew. It all started with a simple step, describing the world around me in English. And that small step led me to a big transformation. Now, I want to share this secret with you. If you want to speak English fluently, train your brain to think in English. Don't translate. Just start describing everything you see. It may feel strange at first, but if you keep going, one day, English will become as natural to you as your own language. 5. Speaking to myself. Since I wasn't ready to talk to other people, I had to find another way to practice speaking English. That's when I got an idea. I would talk to myself. At first, it felt strange, talking to myself in English. Would that even help? But I reminded myself of my goal. If I wanted to speak fluently, I needed to practice as much as possible. And if I wasn't ready to talk to others, at least I could talk to myself. Talking in front of the mirror. Every morning, I stood in front of my mirror and pretended I was having a real conversation. I looked at my reflection, smiled, and spoke as if I were talking to a friend. "Good morning, Haster. How are you today?" I asked myself. "I'm feeling good. Today is going to be a great day," I answered. Then I talked about my plans for the day. "I will go to school. I have a test today. I hope I do well." At first, I felt a little silly. I even laughed at myself. But the more I did it, the more natural it felt. The best part was that I didn't feel shy or nervous. because there was no one else around to judge me. It was just me, my reflection, and my words, describing everything around me. To practice even more, I started describing things around me in English. If I was getting dressed, I would say, I am wearing a blue shirt and black pants. If I was eating breakfast, I would say, I am eating bread with butter, and it tastes delicious. At first, I spoke slowly, searching for the right words. But with time, my words started coming faster. I no longer had to stop and think so much. I was starting to speak naturally, making up conversations. Soon, I decided to make my practice even more interesting. Instead of just talking about my day, I started making up conversations. I imagined I was ordering food at a restaurant. Hello, I would like a sandwich and a cup of tea, please. Or I pretended I was meeting a new friend. Hi, my name is Haster. What's your name? By pretending to have real conversations, I was preparing myself for the day when I would have to speak to real people in English. Overcoming my fear, talking to myself, gave me confidence. I realized that my biggest problem wasn't my vocabulary, it was my fear. The more I spoke, the more comfortable I became with hearing my own voice in English. I no longer worried so much about mistakes. I learned that the important thing was to keep going. Every day, I spoke to myself for longer and longer. At first, I could only do it for a minute or two. Then I spoke for 5 minutes, then 10. Soon, I found myself speaking English without even thinking too much about it. It became a habit, just like brushing my teeth or packing my school bag. A step towards confidence. One day, while I was talking to myself in front of the mirror, I realized something amazing. I wasn't hesitating anymore. My sentences were flowing easily, and I wasn't afraid of making mistakes. That was the moment I knew I was ready for the next step. If I could talk to myself so easily, maybe I could talk to others too. Maybe, just maybe, I could finally start speaking English without fear. 6. Overcoming the fear of mistakes. One of the biggest challenges I faced while learning to speak English was my fear of making mistakes. Every time I tried to speak, I felt nervous. My mind would fill with questions. What if I use the wrong word? What if my grammar is incorrect? What if my pronunciation sounds funny? What if people laugh at me? These thoughts made me so afraid that I would often choose not to speak at all. Instead of trying, I stayed quiet. I believed that if I made mistakes, others would judge me, and I would feel embarrassed. I was scared of failure. But one day in English class, I saw something surprising. Mr. Benson, my English teacher, was explaining a grammar rule when he accidentally mispronounced a word. A few students giggled, and Mr. Benson laughed along with them. Then he smiled and said, "See, even teachers make mistakes. Even native English speakers make mistakes. But mistakes don't stop us from speaking. They help us learn." This made me think, if my teacher, who was an expert in English, could make mistakes without fear, why was I so afraid? Mr. Benson's advice. After class, I went to Mr. Benson and told him about my problem. I explained how I always hesitated because I was scared of saying something wrong. He listened carefully and said, "Haster, making mistakes is not a bad thing. It's a sign that you are learning. Do you know how babies learn to walk? They fall hundreds of times, but they always get up and try again. If they were scared of falling, they would never learn to walk." I nodded. His words made sense. Then he continued, "Speaking a language is just like that. Every time you make a mistake, you get one step closer to fluency. The only real mistake is not trying at all. His words stayed in my mind. I had always seen mistakes as failures, but now I realized that mistakes were lessons. My new rule: keep talking no matter what. That day, I made a promise to myself. No matter how many mistakes I made, I would not stop talking. At first, it was difficult. I still felt nervous, but I forced myself to speak. If I said a sentence wrong, I corrected myself and continued. If someone laughed, I laughed with them instead of feeling embarrassed. One day, I mispronounced a word while talking to my friend. Instead of getting scared, I asked, "Did I say it wrong? Can you help me say it correctly?" My friend smiled and corrected me. Instead of making fun of me, he helped me. That's when I learned another important lesson. Most people don't care about your mistakes. They care about what you were trying to say. A funny experience. A week later, I went to a small cafe and tried to order in English. I wanted to say, "Can I have a cup of tea?" But instead, I accidentally said, "Can I have a cup of tree?" The waiter laughed and said, "A tree? That's a big order." For a second, I felt embarrassed. But then I laughed too. It was just a small mistake, and it didn't matter. The important thing was that I tried. The waiter still understood what I wanted, and I got my tea. That day, I realized something: mistakes make learning fun. Instead of fearing them, I should embrace them. My confidence grows. The more I spoke, the more I realized that mistakes were not stopping me. They were helping me. Each mistake taught me something new. If I used the wrong word, I learned the right one. If my grammar was wrong, I understood how to fix it. If my pronunciation was unclear, I practiced until it got better. Little by little, I became more confident. I stopped thinking too much and just started talking. Now, whenever I see someone afraid to speak English, I tell them, "Don't worry about making mistakes. Just keep talking." If I had let my fear control me, I would have never improved. But because I kept speaking, even when I made mistakes, I became better and more fluent. So, if you are afraid of speaking English, remember, mistakes are not your enemy. They're your best teachers. Stop thinking, start talking, and learn from every mistake. That's how you truly grow. 7. Conversations with friends. After weeks of practicing alone, I knew it was time to take the next big step, talking to my friends in English. Until now, I had only been speaking to myself in front of the mirror, whispering words under my breath as I walked home, and thinking in English inside my mind. But real conversations with real people were different. What if they laughed at me? What if I made mistakes and they corrected me in front of everyone? What if they thought I was acting strange? I sat on my bed thinking about all the possible things that could go wrong. Maybe I wasn't ready yet. Maybe I needed more time. But then I remembered what Mr. Benson had told me. You will never be ready if you keep waiting. The only way to become fluent is to start speaking with people. So, I made a promise to myself. Tomorrow, no matter what happens, I will speak to my friends in English. The first attempt. The next morning, I walked to school with my heart pounding in my chest. My palms felt sweaty, and I kept reminding myself, "Stop thinking, start talking." When I entered the classroom, my best friend, Kevin, waved at me. "Hey, Haster, what's up?" he asked in our native language. I took a deep breath and replied, "I am fine. How are you?" I spoke in English clearly and loudly, just as I had practiced at home. Kevin frowned. He looked at me like I had suddenly grown two heads. "What did you just say?" he asked, laughing. I said, "I am fine. How are you?" I repeated, feeling my face turn red. Another friend, Jason overheard our conversation and joined in. "Why are you speaking English all of a sudden?" he asked with a chuckle. I felt nervous, but I didn't want to stop now. "Because I want to improve my English," I said, my voice shaking a little. Kevin and Jason exchanged amused glances. I braced myself, expecting them to make fun of me. Instead, Kevin smiled. "That's actually a great idea. We all need to get better at English." Jason nodded. "Yeah, but it feels weird. We've never spoken English with each other before." For the first time that day, I laughed. "I know, but if we never start, we will never learn." The struggle of speaking English with friends. At first, our conversations were awkward. Every time I tried to speak, my mind would go blank. I wanted to say simple things, but the words wouldn't come out smoothly. I kept pausing, trying to find the right words, and sometimes I even switched back to my native language without realizing it. One day, during lunch, I tried to say, "Pass me the salt," but instead I hesitated, mumbled, and ended up saying, Can you salt pass?" My friends burst into laughter. I felt embarrassed. "See? I sound terrible." I sighed, but Kevin patted my shoulder and said, "It doesn't matter. At least you were trying. Mistakes don't matter as long as we are learning." Hearing that gave me courage. So, I kept going. The unexpected support from friends. Over the next few days, something surprising happened. My friends, who at first laughed at me, slowly started joining in. One day, Jason asked me in broken English, "How you study English?" I smiled and helped him. "You should say, 'How do you study English?'" Instead of getting annoyed, he laughed and tried again. "How do you study English?" I was shocked. My friends were actually learning with me. Soon, we made a rule. Whoever speaks in our native language during lunch must buy everyone a snack. It was a fun challenge, and it pushed us to keep talking in English, no matter how many mistakes we made. From awkward to confident. At first, we sounded funny. Our sentences were full of mistakes, and sometimes we had to stop and think for a long time before speaking. But after a few weeks, something amazing happened. We started speaking more naturally. The pauses became shorter, the words came out faster, and the fear of making mistakes slowly disappeared. One day, we had a full conversation in English without even realizing it. After finishing, Kevin's eyes widened. "Wait, we just spoke in English the whole time." We all looked at each other and laughed. We had done it. The same friends who had laughed at me before were now speaking English with me every day. My confidence grew, and I started enjoying English more than ever before. Speaking no longer felt like a scary challenge. It felt fun. Looking back, I realized something important. I was never alone in my journey. At first, I thought I was the only one struggling with English, but in reality, my friends also wanted to improve. They just needed someone to take the first step, and that's when I understood courage is contagious. When I overcame my fear and started speaking, my friends followed. If I had kept waiting, I would still be silent today. From that day on, I promised myself I will never let fear stop me from learning again. 8. Talking to strangers. One bright and sunny afternoon, I decided to visit a bookstore in my town. It was a beautiful place filled with the smell of fresh books, wooden shelves stacked high with stories, and the quiet rustling of pages as readers flipped through them. I loved spending time there, walking slowly between the aisles, reading the titles, and imagining all the knowledge hidden inside those books. It was my little world, a place where I felt safe. As I was looking at a book about learning new languages, I noticed something unusual. A man who looked like a foreign tourist was standing near the entrance. He had a confused expression on his face. He kept looking at his phone, then at the bookshelves, then back at his phone again. His eyes moved quickly, and he seemed unsure of where to go. I could tell that he was lost, and he needed help. At that moment, my heart started pounding. A small voice inside my head whispered, "This is your chance, Haster. You have been practicing speaking English. Now is the time to use it." But another voice, the voice of fear, quickly spoke up. "What if you say something wrong? What if he doesn't understand you? What if you embarrass yourself?" I stood there for a few seconds, frozen between two choices. I could walk away, pretend I hadn't seen him, and avoid the risk of making mistakes. Or I could take a deep breath, push my fear aside, and talk to him. I clenched my fists and reminded myself of what Mr. Benson had told me. Stop thinking, start talking. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and walked toward him. My heart was beating so fast that I thought he might hear it. But I didn't stop. When I reached him, I smiled politely and said, "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you find something?" The tourist looked up at me, surprised but relieved. He smiled back and said, "Oh, yes. Thank you. I am looking for books about the history of this country, but I don't know where to find them." For a moment, I felt a wave of panic. What if I didn't know the exact words to explain? What if I stumbled over my sentences? But I quickly pushed those thoughts away. I focused on the fact that he understood me. He had replied in English. I took another deep breath and said, "Oh, I think the history section is over there." I pointed towards the right side of the store where I had seen a section full of history books. "Let me show you." I walked with him to the shelf and said, "Here are the books about history. Do you need help finding a specific book?" He nodded and replied, "Yes, I am looking for a book about ancient civilizations." I wasn't sure which exact book would be best, but I remembered a trick I had learned in my English practice. 9. The power of consistency. At first, speaking English every day felt like a difficult challenge. I had to remind myself constantly, don't stop, keep talking, don't be afraid. But after a few weeks, something magical happened. I no longer had to force myself. Speaking English became a natural part of my day, just like eating breakfast or brushing my teeth. I began to realize that consistency was the secret key to fluency. It was like watering a plant every day. If I skipped watering the plant, it wouldn't grow properly. But if I took care of it daily, it would become stronger and healthier. My English was the same. I needed to use it every day for it to grow, turning English into a habit. Before, I had to remind myself to speak English, but soon it became a habit. I didn't even notice that I was doing it. I would wake up in the morning and think in English. What should I wear today? I have math class first, then English class. I hope lunch is tasty today. I no longer translated my thoughts from my native language. I was thinking directly in English. This was a big moment for me because it meant I was no longer forcing myself to learn. My brain had accepted English as something natural. English everywhere. Once I realized that practicing every day was making me better, I found more ways to bring English into my life. I wanted to learn faster, so I surrounded myself with English as much as possible. Watching English movies. I started watching cartoons, TV shows, and movies in English. At first, I used subtitles, but later, I tried watching without them. I didn't understand every word, but I got the meaning from the actions and expressions of the characters. The more I watched, the more words I recognized. Listening to English podcasts, I found podcasts where people spoke slowly and clearly in English. I listened to them while walking, doing my homework, or lying in bed. At first, it was difficult, but I kept going. My ears got used to hearing English, and I understood more each day. Reading in English. I started reading English books and comics. I even read simple articles online. If I didn't understand a word, I didn't stop. I tried to guess the meaning from the sentence. Writing in English. I kept a small diary where I wrote a few sentences every day. I wrote about my day, my feelings, or something interesting that happened. Writing helped me organize my thoughts in English. A huge change in my speaking. The biggest change happened when I realized I no longer paused while speaking. Before, I used to stop and think, wondering if my words were correct. But now, I just spoke. My words flowed naturally like water from a river. I no longer had to struggle to find the right words. Sentences came to me easily. Even when I made mistakes, I didn't let them stop me. I simply corrected myself and kept going. One day, my teacher, Mr. Benson, noticed this change. He said, "Haster, your English has improved so much. You speak with confidence now." I smiled because I knew why. It wasn't magic, it was consistency. I had spoken English every single day, and that was the real secret to fluency. 10. Speaking in public, elaborated for grade 5 level students. The ultimate test of my journey came when Mr. Benson announced that we would all have to give a speech in front of the class. The moment he said it, my heart started beating fast. My hands felt cold, and my stomach tightened. I had never spoken in front of so many people before, even though I had been practicing English every day. Speaking to my classmates while they all stared at me felt like an impossible challenge. Mr. Benson smiled as he looked at me and said, "Haster, I want you to be the first one to give a speech." I froze. Me? First? My mind started racing. What if I forgot my words? What if my voice shook? What if everyone laughed at me? A million thoughts ran through my head, and for a moment, I wanted to say, "No, I can't do it." But then I remembered the most important lesson I had learned. Stop thinking, start talking. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I can do this. I told myself, I have practice for this. I just need to start. Slowly, I stood up. My legs felt wobbly as I walked to the front of the class. I could feel all eyes on me. My classmates were whispering, and some were even giggling. I felt sweat on my forehead, and my throat felt dry. My fingers were shaking as I held the paper with my speech written on it. Mr. Benson gave me an encouraging nod. "Just start, Haster. You've got this." I looked at my classmates. Some were waiting eagerly, while others were distracted, not paying attention. I swallowed hard, took another deep breath, and finally spoke the first words of my speech. At first, my voice was shaky and soft. I stumbled over my words, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. But I told myself, keep talking. Don't stop. Don't be afraid. So I kept going. With each sentence, I felt my confidence grow. My voice became steadier. My words flowed more smoothly, and I started making eye contact with my classmates. I realized something amazing. No one was laughing at me. Instead, they were listening. I saw my friend Sarah nodding in agreement, and Tom, who usually made jokes, was actually paying attention. That gave me even more courage. I finished my speech, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, suddenly everyone started clapping. I couldn't believe it. They were clapping for me. A huge smile spread across my face. I had done it. I had spoken in front of my entire class. I had faced my fear, and I had won. Mr. Benson clapped the loudest. Well done, Haster. See? I told you, you just had to start. At that moment, I felt something change inside me. I was no longer just a student learning English. I was a speaker, someone who could express thoughts and ideas confidently. I had broken free from my fear, and that day, I learned an important lesson. When you stop overthinking and just start talking, you can do anything. 11. The lesson of a lifetime. Looking back, I realized that my biggest problem was not my vocabulary or grammar. It was my fear. I used to think too much, worry too much, and hesitate too much. But when I stopped thinking and started talking, I finally became fluent. Now, I tell everyone, if you want to speak English fluently, stop thinking and start talking. Practice every day. Embrace your mistakes and keep going. Fluency is not about being perfect. It's about being consistent. 12. My message to you. If you're like me, afraid of speaking English, I want you to remember this. The only way to get better is to start. Speak, even if it's not perfect. Keep talking, even if you make mistakes. The more you practice, the easier it will become. Don't let fear hold you back. Stop thinking, start talking, and watch yourself grow. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to English Tone for more inspiring stories and English learning tips. Keep practicing, and soon, speaking English will be as easy as breathing.